Monsoon Melodies. Chapter 1, A Storm on the Horizon. The sky over the Kerala hills darkened with an ominous weight as clouds gathered, swollen and restless. The plantation workers glanced nervously upward, their sickles and baskets abandoned as the first fat drops of rain splattered against the red earth. Thomas Green stood on the veranda of his bungalow, his boots caked with mud from the day's rounds, and squinted at the horizon. He had learned early that the monsoon wasn't to be underestimated. It swept through the land with wild abandon, transforming orderly rows of tea and rubber into a chaotic sea of green. Still, he thought, better to confront it head-on than let his workers think he was afraid. "Mr. Green, the rains are coming in fast," said Govindan, his head foreman, a wiry man with a face lined from decades in the sun. His tone held a note of warning. Thomas waved him off. "It's just rain," he said, turning to stride down the steps. "We've seen worse." The rain came harder now, slashing through the air with a fury that drenched him before he reached the first row of tea bushes. Thomas pressed on, his steps heavy as the earth turned to sludge beneath his feet. His mind was on the yields this season, a paltry crop, threatened by the unpredictable weather. The plantation needed order, discipline, and modern methods, not the rustic beliefs the locals clung to. Yet it was their stubbornness that fascinated him. Their unwavering trust in ancient practices, be it the cycle of planting or the herbs they used for ailments, stood in stark contrast to his own rational worldview. To Thomas, progress meant science and structure. Superstition had no place in his plantation, or so he thought. By the time he reached the far edge of the estate, the rain was a solid wall, and his body felt leaden. A feverish heat burned behind his eyes, making the world blur. He staggered against a tree trunk, his breath coming in short gasps. "Mr. Green!" Govindan's voice pierced through the drumming rain as he and two workers ran to his side. "You're burning up. You need to rest." Thomas tried to argue, but his legs gave way, sending him collapsing into their arms. He woke to the smell of earth and herbs, the sound of rain still drumming against the roof. The room was dim, lit by a single oil lamp, its light flickering against wooden beams. A woman sat beside him, her hands deftly grinding something in a stone mortar. "You're awake," she said without looking at him. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness in her tone. "Where am I?" His throat was dry, his voice rasping. "In my home," she replied, pouring water into a clay cup and handing it to him. "You collapsed. They brought you here." Her appearance caught him off guard. She wore a simple sari, its hem darkened from rain, and her hair was pulled into a loose braid. A mark of sandalwood adorned her forehead, and her eyes, steady and watchful, seemed to study him as much as he studied her. "I need to get back," he said, attempting to rise, but she pushed him down with surprising strength. "You need to stay still," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Your fever is high. I've made a decoction to bring it down." Thomas frowned. "I don't need Western medicine," she interrupted, her lips curling into a faint smile. "It won't reach you here in time. Trust this, or risk worse." Her confidence irritated him, but he was too weak to protest. He watched as she poured the mixture into a brass bowl and stirred it with practiced precision. The aroma, sharp, bitter, yet oddly soothing, filled the air. "Drink," she said, holding it out to him. He hesitated. "What's in it?" "Things you wouldn't believe in," she said simply. Her answer unsettled him, but he took the bowl, the liquid warm against his palms, and drank. The bitterness made him grimace, but as the warmth spread through his chest, the ache in his limbs seemed to ease. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Meera," she said. The sound of her name lingered in the room, like a note that refused to fade. As the fever ebbed and sleep pulled at him once more, Thomas realized he was caught in something far greater than the monsoon outside, a storm of tradition and belief, embodied by the quiet, enigmatic healer beside him. Chapter 2, Roots of Healing. The morning broke gently, sunlight filtering through the wooden slats of the window, warming the earthen floor of Meera's home. Thomas stirred on the cot, his body heavy but no longer racked by fever. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint aroma of herbs, and for a moment, he was disoriented. The events of the previous day rushed back to him: the rain, the collapse, the healer. Meera. He turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck, to see her seated near the window, sorting dried leaves into neat piles. She moved with quiet precision, her hands sure and steady. "You've survived the night," she said without turning around. Her voice was calm, as though his survival had never been in doubt. "I told you, I didn't need your remedies," he muttered, struggling to sit up. Her lips curved into a faint smile as she placed the leaves into a woven basket. "And yet, here you are. Alive." Thomas ignored the jab, focusing instead on his surroundings. The room was simple, almost austere, but it carried a warmth that made him uneasy. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of powders, roots, and seeds. A stack of palm leaf manuscripts sat neatly in one corner. It was a world so foreign to him, yet undeniably fascinating. "What is this place?" he asked. "My home," she replied, standing and brushing her hands on her sari. "And my clinic." "Clinic?" He raised an eyebrow. "You mean you treat people here?" Meera's expression hardened slightly. "Yes. People come to me when their ailments defy what your hospitals and pills can fix." The subtle challenge in her words wasn't lost on him. "And do they always work?" "Your remedies?" "More often than you'd believe," she said, meeting his gaze. "If you'd open your mind, you might see that there's more to healing than what you've been taught." Thomas scoffed, but his retort was cut short by a knock at the door. A middle-aged woman stepped inside, her face lined with worry. She carried a young boy, no older than 6, whose flushed cheeks and labored breathing spoke of a fever far worse than Thomas's. "Meera, please help him," the woman pleaded, her voice breaking. Without hesitation, Meera crossed the room and took the boy from her arms. She pressed her hand gently against his forehead, her eyes narrowing in focus. "It's a heat fever," she said, laying him down on a mat. "He'll need cooling herbs and rest." Thomas watched as Meera moved with practiced ease, grinding leaves into a paste and mixing them with water. The boy's mother hovered nearby, her faith in Meera's abilities unshakable. "You trust her that much?" Thomas asked, his tone unintentionally sharp. The woman turned to him, her expression one of quiet defiance. "She has saved my family more times than I can count. She doesn't need your kind of medicine to do it." Thomas fell silent, feeling a strange mix of irritation and admiration. Later, as the boy slept peacefully and the woman murmured her thanks, Meera returned to Thomas's side. "Do you see now?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Healing isn't just about science. It's about understanding the body, the spirit, the land." He studied her, searching for a crack in her certainty, but found none. "And where did you learn all this?" "My mother taught me," Meera said, her gaze distant. "And her mother before her. It's knowledge passed down through generations, rooted in this land." Her words carried a weight that unsettled him. Thomas had spent his entire life dismissing such traditions, yet here he was, alive because of them. "You don't trust us," Meera said after a pause, "but you should. The land you own, the people you employ, they're all connected to these roots. You may run this plantation, but you don't truly understand it." The sting of her words made him bristle. "I understand it well enough to keep it running. For now," she said, her tone neither mocking nor conciliatory. "But the monsoon will test you in ways you're not prepared for." By the time Govindan arrived to escort him back to the plantation, Thomas felt steadier on his feet but far from settled in his mind. As he mounted his horse, he turned to Meera, who stood by the doorway watching him with her arms crossed. "I don't know what you're trying to prove," he said. I'm not trying to prove anything, she replied. I'm simply showing you what's already there. As he rode away, the rain-soaked hills seemed different, somehow less a backdrop to his ambitions and more alive, pulsing with secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. The storm had passed, but Thomas knew the real turbulence had only just begun. Chapter 3, Shadows of the Past. The plantation was alive with noise as Thomas returned, the rhythmic thud of workers pounding the wet earth mingling with the screech of crickets and the occasional sharp bark of commands. It should have been reassuring, the sense of order restored, but the ride back from Meera's home had left Thomas in an unfamiliar state of unease. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Govindan hovered nearby, as watchful as ever. "You're looking better, Mr. Green," he said. "The healer's work, no doubt." Thomas grunted. "She's competent." He wasn't ready to admit more than that. Govindan gave a knowing smile but didn't press. Instead, he motioned toward the workers in the distance. "The rains have slowed progress. The men say we'll need another week to finish clearing the eastern grove." "Another week?" Thomas asked sharply. "That's unacceptable. I'll speak with them myself." Govindan's face tightened. "With respect, sir, they've already endured a lot. The monsoon has taken a toll, and it's their job." Thomas cut him off, striding toward the grove. As he approached the workers, the air grew thick with tension. The men straightened when they saw him, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and wariness. A few cast quick, furtive glances at one another. "Why isn't the work done?" Thomas demanded, his voice carrying over the field. A man stepped forward hesitantly. His name was Raghavan, one of the older workers. "The rains have made it difficult, Sahib," he said, his voice low but firm. "The ground is too soft for the carts, and the leeches." "Leeches?" Thomas snapped. "You're stopping for leeches? Do you think crops wait for comfort?" Raghavan held his gaze, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the handle of his sickle. "We're doing our best, Sahib, but we are not machines." The defiance in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas opened his mouth to retort, but something in Raghavan's expression stopped him. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was resentment, simmering just beneath the surface. Thomas turned on his heel, muttering, "Get back to work," and strode away. Later that evening, Thomas sat on the veranda of his bungalow, nursing a tumbler of whiskey. The rain had returned, a steady drizzle that turned the landscape into a blurry watercolor. He thought of Meera's words, "The land you own, the people you employ, they're all connected to these roots." It grated on him how easily she spoke of things she couldn't possibly understand. And yet, he took a long sip, trying to drown the thought, but his mind betrayed him. He remembered the way Raghavan had looked at him, not with the fear he'd grown accustomed to from the workers, but with something sharper. His father's voice echoed in his memory, "Fear keeps them in line, Thomas. Respect is a luxury you can't afford." That night, sleep came fitfully, bringing with it dreams of his childhood. He was a boy again, following his father through the rows of a tea plantation in Ceylon. His father's shadow loomed large, his voice sharp and commanding. "You'll inherit this one day," his father had said, gesturing to the endless green. "But don't let sentiment blind you. This is business, Thomas. These men work for you because they have to, not because they want to." In the dream, Thomas turned to the workers, their faces indistinct but their eyes burning with something he couldn't name. When he looked back, his father was gone, replaced by Meera, standing barefoot in the rain, her eyes piercing through the haze. "You don't understand them," she said. "And you never will if you keep looking at them like that." He woke with a start, his breath shallow. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. The next day, as he made his rounds, Thomas noticed things he hadn't before. The workers moved with a sluggishness that wasn't just physical. There was an air of discontent, quiet but undeniable. Near the workers' quarters, he found a small group gathered around a young man speaking animatedly. He recognized the speaker as Ravi, a fiery worker who had always seemed to resent Thomas's authority. Thomas couldn't hear what Ravi was saying, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, frustration, rebellion. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas approached Ravi, who met his gaze without flinching. "You've got a lot to say these days," Thomas said, his voice cold. Ravi shrugged. "People are tired, Sahib. Tired of working themselves to death for nothing." "Nothing," Thomas repeated, his temper flaring. "You have wages, housing, and no dignity," Ravi interrupted, his voice rising. "Do you even see us, Sahib? Or are we just part of the machinery to you?" Thomas took a step forward, his fists clenched, but something in Ravi's words struck a chord he couldn't ignore. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them as thick as the humid air. "I see you," Thomas said finally, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Ravi shook his head. "No, Sahib. You see what you want to see. Until that changes, nothing here ever will." As Ravi walked away, Thomas felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. He had always thought of himself as different from his father, but now he wasn't so sure. The shadows of the past loomed large, and for the first time, Thomas wondered if he had the courage to step out from beneath them. Chapter 4: Seeds of Rebellion. The first light of dawn spilled over the plantation, but it did little to brighten the mood. The rains had subsided for now, but the ground remained saturated, making every step a fight against the sucking mud. Thomas walked briskly toward the foreman's quarters, his thoughts still circling Ravi's biting words from the day before. He hadn't been able to shake them. The accusation "you see what you want to see" stung more than he cared to admit. Govindan greeted him at the threshold, his usual calm replaced with a hint of unease. "Sir, there's something you should see." Thomas followed Govindan to a clearing near the workers' quarters. A group of labourers stood in tense silence, their heads bowed but their shoulders rigid. At their feet lay a cart of overturned tea baskets, the leaves scattered and trampled into the mud. "What happened here?" Thomas asked sharply. Raghavan stepped forward, his expression grim. "The cart broke, Sahib. We tried to salvage what we could, but..." Thomas glanced at the damage, his frustration mounting. This was the third such incident in as many weeks. Why wasn't this repaired earlier? "I gave orders to." "We don't have the tools," Raghavan interrupted, his tone steady but laced with frustration. "You've been delaying replacements for months." Thomas opened his mouth to argue but stopped. He knew Raghavan was right. With the monsoon disrupting shipments and the colonial administration tightening its grip on resources, priorities had shifted. But he hadn't explained that to the workers, hadn't thought it necessary. "I'll see to it that the tools arrive soon," he said finally, his voice clipped. Ravi, who had been standing near the back of the group, let out a derisive laugh. "Soon, Sahib? That's what you always say." The murmurs among the workers grew louder, their frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's enough," Thomas snapped, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get back to work. I'll deal with this." The workers dispersed reluctantly, their expressions betraying their growing resentment. Back at the bungalow, Thomas found himself pacing the veranda, the events of the morning replaying in his mind. The tension among the workers was reaching a breaking point, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. "You look troubled," came a familiar voice. Thomas turned to see Meera standing at the edge of the veranda, her sari damp from the lingering mist. He hadn't heard her approach, but her presence felt oddly reassuring. "I didn't realize I invited you," he said dryly. Meera ignored his tone and stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Govindan told me about the unrest. I thought you might need help." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't need your remedies for this, Meera." "Maybe not," she said, leaning against the wooden railing. But you might need perspective. He frowned, ready to dismiss her, but something in her expression made him pause. Go on, then. What's your perspective? She tilted her head, studying him. The workers are angry because they feel invisible. You think giving them orders is enough, but they want to be seen. To be heard. I pay them fair wages, Thomas countered. Provide housing, food. And still, they feel like they don't matter, Meera interrupted. You think it's just about money and tools, but it's more than that. They want to know their lives mean something to you. Her words unsettled him. And how exactly am I supposed to prove that? Meera smiled faintly. Start by listening. That evening, Thomas walked down to the workers' quarters, where small oil lamps flickered in the gathering dark. Groups of men and women sat outside their huts, sharing quiet conversations over modest meals. Thomas approached one of the groups, his presence drawing wary glances. Ravi was among them, his expression unreadable. I want to hear what you have to say, Thomas said, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. The workers exchanged surprised looks, unsure if this was a trap or a genuine gesture. Ravi was the first to speak. You want to listen now, Sahib? After all this time? Yes, Thomas said, forcing himself to hold Ravi's gaze. I've made mistakes. I want to fix them. There was a pause, and then the words spilled out a litany of grievances, from broken tools to unsafe working conditions to the relentless demands of the plantation. As the workers spoke, their voices rising with anger and emotion, Thomas felt the weight of their frustration pressing down on him. When they finally fell silent, he nodded slowly. I can't promise to fix everything overnight. But I will do better. You have my word. The group was quiet, their skepticism palpable. Ravi studied him for a long moment before speaking. Words are easy, Sahib. Prove it. Thomas nodded again. I will. Later, as he walked back to the bungalow, he found Meera waiting for him at the edge of the grove. You were right, he admitted grudgingly. I usually am, she said with a small smile. He stopped beside her, staring out at the darkened plantation. I don't know if it's enough, he said quietly. It's a start, Meera replied. And sometimes, that's all you need. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Thomas felt something shift within him. The storm he'd been battling wasn't just outside, it was inside him, tearing at the foundations of everything he thought he knew. But for the first time, he was ready to face it. Chapter 5, The Monsoon's Test. The monsoon returned in earnest that week, its torrential rain turning the plantation into a quagmire. Rivers overflowed their banks, trees bent under the force of the wind, and the air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. For Thomas, it was as if the storm outside mirrored the tension within the plantation. He had made promises, but keeping them was proving harder than expected. The tools he'd ordered hadn't arrived. Supply routes were flooded, and the colonial administration seemed indifferent to his plight. Every day brought new challenges: fallen trees blocking roads, sick workers unable to perform their duties, and the relentless pressure to keep the estate running despite it all. You're pushing them too hard, Govindan warned one afternoon as they stood beneath a makeshift shelter near the eastern grove. I don't have a choice, Thomas replied, his voice taut. If we fall behind, we lose the harvest. And if we lose the harvest, we lose everything. Govindan shook his head. You're not hearing me, sir. They'll break before the plantation does. That evening, Thomas found himself riding through the plantation despite the rain. He needed to clear his head, to find some way to reconcile his promises with the reality he faced. The storm's fury was at its peak when he saw Meera standing near the edge of the river, her sari plastered to her skin by the rain. She was gesturing urgently to a group of workers, her voice barely audible over the roar of the water. What's going on? Thomas called as he dismounted, the wind tearing at his coat. The river is rising, Meera said, her tone brisk. It's going to flood the lower fields. If we don't move the workers and their families now, they'll be trapped. Thomas glanced at the swollen river, its surface churning angrily. The water was already encroaching on the path. I'll get them out, he said, his voice firm. Meera hesitated, then nodded. We need to hurry. The evacuation was chaotic. The rain blurred everything into a frenzy of movement, workers scrambling to gather their belongings, children crying, and livestock braying in fear. Thomas and Meera worked side by side, urging people to higher ground and helping carry the elderly and the infirm. At one point, Thomas found himself wading into waist-deep water to rescue a young boy who had slipped and fallen. The current was stronger than he anticipated, nearly pulling him under, but he managed to reach the boy and carry him to safety. When they finally regrouped on higher ground, drenched and exhausted, Thomas looked around at the gathered workers. They were wet, shivering, and visibly shaken, but they were alive. You did well, Meera said softly, standing beside him. He shook his head. It's not enough. They shouldn't have been in danger to begin with. Meera's gaze was steady. Nature doesn't care about our plans, Thomas. It's unpredictable, uncontrollable. But you showed them today that you care. That's a start. The next morning, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The fields below were completely submerged, the crops ruined. Thomas stood on the hillside, surveying the damage with a sinking heart. This will set us back months, he said, his voice hollow. Govindan joined him, his expression grim. It's bad, sir. But the workers are talking. They saw what you did last night. It's earned you some respect. Thomas nodded absently, his thoughts racing. Respect was all well and good, but it wouldn't save the plantation. Meera approached then, her hands wrapped around a clay pot. This is for the workers, she said, holding it out. What is it? Thomas asked. Chyawanprash, she replied. An herbal tonic. It will help them recover their strength after last night. Thomas took the pot, the weight of it oddly comforting. You seem to think herbs can solve everything. She smiled faintly. Not everything. But they're a start. As she turned to leave, Thomas called after her. Meera, why do you keep helping me? You don't owe me anything. She paused, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. This land is my home, too. If it falls, we all fall. Her words stayed with him as he walked back to the workers' quarters, the clay pot cradled in his arms. That night, Thomas gathered the workers for a meeting. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and smoke from the cooking fires. We've lost a lot, he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The fields are flooded, and the harvest is gone. But we're not beaten. Together, we can rebuild. There was a murmur among the crowd, skeptical but not dismissive. I'll make sure we have the tools we need, Thomas continued. And I'll fight for better conditions for all of us. But I need your help. This plantation doesn't run without you. The workers exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Ravi stepped forward, his face still guarded but less hostile than before. We'll give you a chance, Sahib, he said. But don't make promises you can't keep. Thomas nodded, meeting Ravi's gaze. I won't. As the workers began to disperse, Meera appeared at his side. You're learning, she said quietly. I'm trying, he replied, his tone earnest. The monsoon had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but for the first time, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. The storm had taken much, but it had also given him something precious, a chance to rebuild, not just the plantation, but himself. Chapter 6, A Fragile Alliance. The monsoon's lingering rains began to ease, leaving behind a plantation transformed. The once vibrant fields were now patches of sodden earth, the tea bushes drowned and lifeless. Workers moved with grim determination, their faces etched with exhaustion and uncertainty. Despite the enormity of the losses, there was a tenuous energy, a fragile alliance born of shared struggle and hard-won respect. Thomas threw himself into the task of rebuilding, his days consumed by meetings with Govindan, overseeing repairs and drafting letters to the colonial authorities. The requests for supplies and financial assistance were met with indifference or outright refusal. "They won't help," Thomas muttered, slamming a rejection letter onto his desk. "They never do," Govindan replied quietly. "You'll have to find another way." One afternoon, Thomas stood at the edge of the plantation, watching as workers cleared debris and began replanting where they could. Meera approached, her presence as steadying as the first clear skies after a storm. "They're working harder than I've ever seen," Thomas said, gesturing to the workers. "I didn't think it was possible." "They believe in what they're doing," Meera said. "Because for the first time, they feel like it matters." Thomas hesitated. "I still don't know if I deserve their trust." "Trust isn't about being perfect," Meera said. "It's about showing up. You've done that." He nodded, but doubt lingered. "It's not enough, though. The plantation's survival depends on more than hard work. Without a harvest, we're finished." Meera studied him for a moment, then said, "There's something I want to show you. Meet me at the Western Grove at sunset." At sunset, Thomas arrived at the grove, where Meera was waiting with a group of villagers. They carried woven baskets filled with small plants, spindly but vibrant, their leaves glistening with dew. "What's this?" Thomas asked, eyeing the plants curiously. Meera smiled. "A gift. These are native tea saplings, bred to withstand heavy rains. My father cultivated them years ago. They grow slower than the imported varieties, but their roots are stronger. They won't drown in the next monsoon." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "You've been holding out on me." "I wasn't sure you were ready," she said simply. "But now, I think you are." Thomas stepped closer, inspecting the saplings. "If we plant these, we'll have to start over. It'll take years to see any profit." "It will," Meera agreed. "But they'll last. And so will the people who plant them." He glanced at the workers who had come with her, their faces filled with quiet determination. This was more than a solution, it was a chance to rebuild the plantation on a foundation of resilience and community. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." The replanting effort began the next day. The workers took to the task with a sense of purpose, each sapling planted a symbol of hope. Thomas worked alongside them, his hands blistered and his clothes caked with mud. The days stretched into weeks, the rhythm of labor punctuated by moments of camaraderie. Thomas found himself learning more about the workers, their families, their struggles, their dreams. One evening, as they rested by a fire, Ravi approached Thomas with a cup of steaming chai. "You've changed, Sahib," Ravi said, handing him the cup. Thomas accepted it, the warmth seeping into his hands. "Maybe I've just started paying attention." Ravi nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The workers see it too. They're starting to believe in you." Thomas sipped the chai, the bitterness giving way to a subtle sweetness. "Let's hope it's enough." As the weeks passed, the plantation began to show signs of life. The new saplings took root, their vibrant green leaves a stark contrast to the muddy earth. The workers' quarters were repaired, and new tools arrived, thanks to Thomas's tireless negotiations with local traders. One evening, as Thomas stood overlooking the plantation, Meera joined him. "You've done well," she said. "We've done well," he corrected. She smiled. "True. But you've changed the most. You're not the man who arrived here months ago." He glanced at her, his expression serious. "And you're not just an Ayurvedic healer. You've been the heart of this place, Meera." Her cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. "Maybe we've both found what we were looking for." They stood in silence, the horizon painted with the fiery hues of sunset. The plantation still had a long road ahead, but for the first time, the future felt possible. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight kissed the new tea leaves, Thomas called the workers together. "This plantation isn't just mine," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It belongs to all of us. From this day forward, we'll share the harvest, the profits, and the responsibility. Together, we'll build something that lasts." The workers erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a chorus of hope. As Thomas looked out over the sea of faces, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known since arriving in Kerala. The monsoon had tested him, but it had also transformed him, washing away the man he thought he was and revealing the man he was meant to be. And as Meera stood by his side, her hand brushing his, he realized that the storm had brought him more than survival. It had brought him home.